Greetings, my name is Gene Badgelan, in for Jason Miles on this very special Christmas break pre-record. So we are not coming to you live, we are coming to you from the past, and that will be the topic for the day. The past. We have a very special guest with us today to talk about the English Revolution, a revolution that is often forgotten by many on the left. Uh, but before that, I would like to remind you all to like and subscribe. Your support helps us advance the channel and allows us to bring to you more content, more shows, and more information. So, as I said, today's topic is the English Revolution of the 17th century. And of course, this is an important political moment in not only British history, but the history of the development of modern capitalism, of the modern world. This was something well known to Marxists, liberals in the 19th century, the importance of the English Revolution. In fact, if you go outside of the British Parliament, you will see a statue of Oliver Cromwell, which is kind of interesting because Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the Republic, or as we called it, the Commonwealth, that replaced the Stuart monarchy for a brief period of time in the 17th century. And so the person I wanted to bring on today is a friend of show. It is the writer and author Steve Paxton, who is at present, I believe, working on something to do with the English Revolution. So I'd like you all to give a TIR. Welcome to Steve. Steve, welcome back to TIR.
Hi, good to be here again.
So you're currently, your new book is out. We talked about that, How Capitalism Ends.
That's right.
We talked about that last time you came on. But currently, I believe you're working on something to do with the English Revolution. We've discussed this off air before, that you've been thinking about the importance of the English Revolution. So could you give us an outline of what you're working on and why you think the English Revolution is important?
Sure. I think on both sides of the Atlantic and basically everywhere, people kind of underestimate the importance of it and the kind of historical significance of it, and also what we can learn from the English Revolution. Most people in England, actually, if you said the English Revolution to them, that phrase would just mean nothing. They would assume you're talking about some future event. So I suppose to get into the background of it a bit, if you go back to the way Marx looks at the development of capitalism, he uses the term revolution in different ways. So in some ways in his kind of theoretical work, he talks about a revolution as being the transition from one economic structure to another. And then in the later chapters of Volume 1 of Capital, he goes into quite a lot of detail about that process, that transition from feudalism to capitalism happening in England, kind of from 1500 really up until his lifetime in the 19th century. And elsewhere, though, he uses the term revolution when he's talking about the French Revolution, for example. He uses the term just the same way as everyone else does, to mean the kind of political seizure of power. So there is some inconsistency there in how the term revolution is used at all. And as far as I know, I don't think Marx ever uses the phrase the English Revolution, but he does talk about the transition from feudalism to capitalism as a revolution, and he does talk about that process in England. Then in the 1930s, you get Christopher Hill, who's a Marxist historian at Oxford. He writes a book called The English Revolution, and he's referring to the events of the 1640s, the civil wars and the regicide, the execution of Charles I. And he's really, he's kind of saying, look, guys, this is like the French Revolution. This is the same process. This is the emerging bourgeoisie seizing power from the feudal aristocracy. And that leads to a lot of backwards and forwards, and a lot of arguments among academic historians from the 30s right up until kind of, I guess, those arguments are still going on in the 80s and 90s. They've kind of faded away now, because despite what people on the right would have you believe, British universities aren't any more controlled by Marxists than American universities.
The dominant paradigm, I think, that's kind of emerging within British academia now, is to call it the War of Three Kingdoms. right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's framed, so people are aware. It's framed within the context of a push towards absolutism and the difficulties of that the English monarchy was having welding together its empire, which was made up not only of England, which was a discrete legal entity, but the kingdoms of Scotland and Ireland as well. So there's very much this kind of discussion about the consolidation of power, which is not necessarily, you know, it's not doesn't necessarily kind of disprove the English Revolution thesis, but it does definitely shift the balance of power, the balance away from discussing class conflict towards this question of state consolidation and the consolidation of power. And so people who are not at all aware of the English Civil War, what we're specifically talking about is the rebellion against Charles the First. Charles the First was the son of the Scottish King James, who became the King of England as England and Scotland were unifying, and as in many places in Europe, there was a gradual kind of push towards reducing the power of the aristocracy and the autonomy of different elements of society. It pushed towards this absolutism, royal absolutism, which was a kind of phenomena of Europe in the early modern period. But unlike in places like France, where you saw the emergence of a strong absolute monarch, in Britain, there was a rebellion against this tendency, and the monarchy was overthrown, and Britain became briefly a republic under, basically under a military dictatorship for a while.
Sure. Yeah. So Hill is the first one really that calls this the English Revolution, and you're right. The War of Three Kingdoms. I think Scottish and Irish histories, school histories, have been taught as the War of Three Kingdoms for quite a while. In England, this period is always called the English Civil War at school, and still is. And this idea that kind of Marxist historians hold sway in academia or anywhere else is shown to be nonsense by the fact that it's nearly 100 years ago that Christopher Hill came up with this kind of Marxist interpretation, and it's basically been ignored by outside of academia, where there are arguments about it, but certainly in mainstream history we still talk about the Civil War, and the War of Three Kingdoms is a kind of another way of looking at it, and that's very much about the nationalist elements rather than the class elements. So what I'm trying to do really is to draw all these threads together. So I think it's really valuable to see the revolution as this long process, this long transition from feudalism to capitalism. There is an element there where there is some resistance then from people who say, well, that's not really a revolution, that's like a transition. But I don't care, call it a transition if you like, but then you only get into the same set of arguments about what that means as we're already having about what revolution means. The main thing, I think, is certainly from a historical materialist perspective, the significant change was the long process, the technological developments that started to gather pace really around 1500, and it permitted an increase in productive capacity. There was kind of an agricultural revolution. So we went from a situation where basically almost everyone worked on the land and only really produced enough food for themselves. In 1500, for example, 75% of English people worked on the land. So each person is producing enough agricultural produce for themselves and a third of another person. But once you start to get technological developments where you can get more productive capacity coming out, then you can free up more people not to work on the land, and that gives you a material condition, which means that the development of other industries and eventually the factory system and things like that start to become possible. The fact that they become possible doesn't mean that they're then inevitable. You then still need moves towards that, but various kind of global and national developments may mean that those things become attractive to certain landowners, and a lot of landowners start to move away from this very traditional customary society and see the opportunities of actually going kind of into business, treating land as an investment rather than a status symbol, and preferring to have employees that they can either move from one workplace to another, or just lay off when they're not when they don't need them, and take them on when they do need them, prefer to having kind of serfs that are tied to the land, and that they've got a kind of a feudal obligation to make sure that those people survive to some extent. And so you get these long, it's very long-term process that goes on for a couple of 100 years, and it's basically technological development enables different economic and social arrangements between people, and then those create better. That enables people to create even more technological development, which provides more productive capacity, and this kind of thing starts to build up like a kind of snowball effect. And it gains a lot of momentum, and the people that are kind of making the most money out of that obviously are gaining a lot of economic power, and are gaining power to actually do things. But what's holding them back is that the political framework is still this feudal kind of aristocracy, this pyramid with the aristocracy and the crown at the top. And the crown resists all this, and the state resists this situation. There's a lot of talk. So there's a enclosure. Well, maybe we should talk about that later. Actually, go into the details a bit later. But the main point at the moment is that the crown resists this kind of this process that's happening. That's this social and economic transformation and technological development is resisted by the hierarchy in the old order, and that's what comes to a head in 1640 with the Civil War, which is really the kind of emerging bourgeois interest trying to kind of throw off the shackles of this feudal political state.
And I think, you know, it's I think when we talk about the Stuart monarchy and, you know, this feudal political state, you know, their objective is maintaining the stability of society, which means resisting new technology that might disrupt old existing ways of life, you know, granting monopolies, all these kind of things. Which,
and the things that the closer people are to the monarch in that hierarchy, the more they have to lose and the more they resist. And it's people kind of on the periphery of that. There is some sort of element of kind of an independent peasantry with a kind of a kulak class rising out of that. But the real big kind of movers and shakers in that situation are people on the periphery of the kind of the feudal hierarchy who've got some land but aren't really close enough to the top of the pyramid to be getting that much benefit out of it, and can see something better that they can do, and they start doing this stuff, and it's that gets
and there are also defectors from within the kind of closer to the center of the ruling class.
Sure.
As well. And, you know, interestingly enough, there's also an ideological divide between this, with those kind of emerging capitalist farmers, as well as kind of progressive elements from within the, you know, state elite and state apparatus, you know, centered around the practice of Protestantism, between nonconformism and the state religion, which is a kind of, you know, Anglicanism is the state religion of Britain, but under the Stuarts there was very much a shift to Catholicize it to a certain extent in terms of the way that it was practiced. So an emphasis on ritual. I mean, this is one of the things I always remember from Christopher Hill, is like he compared the sermons of the nonconformists to the Anglicans, whereas the Anglican Church was a lot about ritual. The nonconformists had far more intellectual content in terms of their preaching. So, you know, this political conflict is also being overlaid with ideological shifts taking place within, and even in conservatism, because you get someone like Thomas Hobbes, who, you know, is kind of a monarchist, but instead of making the usual monarchist argument, he tries to make a materialist argument for monarchism. So this is a really like fundamental break that's taking place at this period.
Sure. I think it's although we can discern these kind of broad processes, and I kind of tend to split into two. There are two broad historical periods, one from 1500 to 1640, and then there's this kind of political upheaval from 1640 to 1688, and then the second period is after 1688, and the real difference there is that before 1640, the state is backing the feudal. The state is really personified by the crown, and that's backing the feudal resistance to change. But after 1688, the state is really in control of the emerging bourgeois interest and is really backing the development of capitalism. But although we can see these kind of broad periods, it's really important not to think not to think of this in really black and white terms. It was a really messy period, and although the Civil War had people, there were a lot of historians when Christopher Hill started framing this and saying, look, this is the bourgeois interest fighting against feudal lords. You had historians coming along saying, well, what about this guy? He was on the wrong side according to you. He owned a big farm, or he was he was a merchant, yet he was on the royalist side, or whatever. But it was very messy, and as you say, religion was tied up with a lot of it, and religious convictions aren't things that people can let go of very easily. So even though they might politically or economically look like they're on the wrong side in the way they view it, they're on the right side because of their religious views.
And not just that, but like revolutions in general are often triggered by defections from within the ruling class.
Sure.
I mean, this is, the American Revolution was made by landowners and country lawyers. The French Revolution was triggered by a revolt of the aristocrats. Yeah. The Russian Revolution was made by petty bourgeois and bourgeois elements. So the notion, that these revolutions are always just like one class versus another class in a very crude way misunderstands very often the extremely prominent role of elements from within the existing ruling class in being involved and leading the revolution, because very often those are the people who have time to contemplate the situation. They have the luxury of being able to do these kind of things. I think there is sometimes a little bit of a crude mischaracterization of like what one means by the bourgeois revolution, in that that like all the bourgeoisie got together and overthrew all of the feudal aristocracy, when that is certainly not the real historical process. Like you said, messy.
Sure, and often in the bourgeois revolution, a lot of that consists of feudal landowners just changing putting their operations on a more capitalist footing. Mm-hmm. They're not actually rising up against themselves. They're just seeing that there's a different way to go, and that maybe it might be in their interests because of their class location. If they can change the way their operations work, then they might benefit more from that. So often it's kind of it's a process of it's not a question of one group of people overthrowing another necessarily. It's sometimes just a group of people changing the way they behave. And changing the kind of the basis of their ownership, but I think even after sort of 1640 was the start of the Civil War. 1642 was the start of the Civil War. King Charles I was executed in 1649. The war rumbled on for a bit, but then, as you've mentioned, we had the Interregnum, the Commonwealth, the Republic, led by Cromwell, So he had, towards the end of the Civil War, he had basically turned on the left and the working class of his supporters, and when he established himself as the Lord Protector, he basically had eyes on becoming a new monarchy. Really, he's starting a new dynasty, even to the point that when he died, he ensured that his eldest son succeeded him. Mm-hmm. And something that's kind of interesting about that as well is that his eldest son was quite incompetent, and this is kind of
he buggered off.
But also he had a younger son who was a really competent kind of politician, strategist, diplomat, military general. But it couldn't go to him because that's not how monarchy works. Is it has to go to the.
And
he was really kind of looking for the best successor. He would surely have gone to his second son, but what he was actually doing was trying to replicate the kind of the way that monarchy works by handing all the power over to his eldest son.
But it was a different type of monarchy in the sense that in the sense that it was monarchy as a political form is compatible with capitalism. It's just a particular a particular form of monarchy, a move from a feudal form. I mean, we see this in the French Revolution. Cromwell, is analogous to Napoleon Bonaparte in certain ways.
Exactly, yeah. And in both cases, there's a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's in France and in England, in England we went through kind of Cromwell and then we had the restoration of Charles II, who was son of Charles I, who'd been executed. And then the Glorious Revolution, which removed Charles and brought in William of Orange, and that's really when we moved to a constitutional monarchy. So in France, they had the July monarchy. They had the Bourbon Restoration, didn't they? The July monarchy, the Second Republic, the Second Empire, which was Napoleon Bonaparte, wasn't it? And then the Third Republic from 1871. And in both cases, actually, there was a flashpoint where the workers actually tried to get in on the act. So in France, you get the Paris Commune. In England, you get the Banbury Mutiny and the Levellers and the Putney debates and these things where people who have actually done all the fighting are kind of saying, right, so where's our reward then? And the bourgeoisie is saying, sorry guys, this wasn't.
Let's not go too far. Let's not go. So let's talk about that. So the one of the aspects of any political revolution is that it unleashes a variety of different social and political forces, and often creates these alliances of convenience between different social forces. And also the process of revolution itself radicalizes people in certain directions. And the English Civil War was a particularly bloody conflict that took place over an extended period of time. One of the reasons the king got himself executed was because originally they arrested him, and I think they stuck him on the Isle of Wight, and he ran away, and people were worried that there was going to be a second civil war. So this was an violent, extended conflict that took place. And of course, the political forces that won out in the end were kind of the elite parliamentary forces that wanted to have some kind of limited monarchy based on the compromises that had been enacted before the war. The reason they didn't execute Charles was that they just wanted him to accept the kind of compromises that they demanded prior to the Civil War. And then, of course, you have the regicide, and then, of course, the Parliament is kind of repressed, and we see the emergence of the Lord Protectorship, and then a restoration of the monarchy. So that's kind of the brief history. But throughout that, leadership of society remains within this kind of landlord capitalist, progressive elements of the old feudal elites. Those are the guys who are dominating society. But you mentioned a couple of names there: the Putney debates, the Levellers, there's the Diggers, there's other sources. What was the radical wing of the English Revolution?
So it was, as you alluded to earlier, it was it had a religious aspect to it, in that the monarchy was kind of wavering between Catholicism and high church Anglicanism, which is kind of Catholicism but without the religion, if that makes sense. Anglicanism is like it's like Christianity.
Catholicism, but the king's the pope.
You get all the ritual and everything else, but you don't actually have to bother believing in anything really. And then the nonconformists were the Protestants, much more like European Protestants, who had kind of religious reasons for not going along with Roman Catholicism. And so those nonconformists were kind of they were the most radical section of society. They were often persecuted more than anyone else, and they included some people that were relatively conservative in their political views, given that they were on the more sort of progressive wing of things. But they also included some very radical groups, such as the Levellers, the Diggers, the Ranters. And these groups really, it's really interesting when you read their political pamphlets and things, is that they don't really know what they want. They're still working it out. What they know is what they've got isn't fair. They talk a lot about natural rights, but they also talk about the rights of freeborn Englishmen. So and very, very occasionally, even women get a shout as well. But that's not usual at this time. But the being born in England seems to is a thing. It's like I've got civil rights. I'm in this society. I've got civil rights. And when they're talking about the franchise, they're saying, well, if every freeborn Englishman should have a vote. We shouldn't be governed by people that we don't give consent to. And so on the one hand, you've got people opposing that, just kind of like, this is, I think one of the arguments is you don't have a stake in society. If you're a property owner, you should have a vote. But if all you own is stuff you can carry about on your own back, you could just go and live in another kingdom if you don't like what's happening here. So you don't have anything to lose. You don't have any stake in society, so you don't deserve a vote. But there's another opposition to that, which comes from Ireton, who's a general in the Parliamentarian Army, who's actually Cromwell's son-in-law. And he sees where this is going. He's saying, well, hang on a minute. If you're demanding an equal vote on the basis of being a freeborn Englishman, how long is it going to be before you start demanding an equal amount of land and an equal house? And you could take the clothes off my back and steal my money and have my tobacco and everything else. And how could I stop you if you have a right to it just as much as I do, just by virtue of you being English? Where will this end? And it's interesting because that's quite, he sees that argument quite, this is 1647
before even the radicals have fully worked out that argument.
Sure, yeah. I mean, all they're asking for is a vote, and he's going, hang on a minute.
Slippery slope.
This is the start of the slippery slope, which indeed, if you look at the process, the progress of, the ideology under capitalism, that's where we've got to, is that we've got the vote, and now we're saying, hang on a minute, what about the resources? What about the stuff that actually would produce a free and equal society? You've got to hand over some of the stuff that you have somehow accumulated but can't really justify your ownership of.
So so this really is, like these radical groups, like the Levelers, and there's differences between them. The Diggers are more kind of like squatters. Would that be a good term?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
They're kind of like taking control of land and setting up communes, whereas the Levelers are far more of a kind of overtly political movement, in the sense that they're moving towards this kind of universalism, the kind of basis for modern mass democracy, which is the notion that there is a nation and everybody in that nation deserves free the same civic, not only the same rights and rights, which perhaps the higher elements within the English elite would be happy to concede, like a universality in front of the law, but also demanding a universality in terms of political rights and participation in the institutions of parliamentary democracy. So whereas the kind of parliamentary wing of the elite parliamentary wing of the Civil War was pushing for this kind of civic equality, but not political equality. The Levelers were the kind of next step to that, which of course incited a kind of reaction amongst those property owning elites like Ireton, who were, where is this going to get it? And they must have been specifically terrified because this was not just randos, this was their army.
They built an army. They built a really efficient, it was called the New Model Army, and it was a really efficient fighting machine. And now suddenly they hadn't been paid for weeks. The army were demanding all their back pay. And the threat was that they would send them to Ireland. Any agitators, they would send it off to an Irish campaign, which would be lots more fighting and no chance of being discharged and going home. But also there was some really brutal fighting going on in Ireland. So it's kind of like the threat of being sent to the Eastern Front in World War II. It was sort of that kind of, if you don't behave, this is what we'll do. And they tried to split up the regiments so that they would, but actually they tried to split them up to prevent the spread of these ideas. But actually they just facilitated the spread of these ideas by spreading out all the people that were talking about them and creating pamphlets and things. But and eventually Cromwell was very underhand, and he ended up murdering the leaders of the Levellers in Burford churchyard in 1649, I think.
But you have
So
a situation. It's like kind of like the Russian Revolution. You have at the end of the war a situation of dual power. I mean, Trotsky in his history of the Russian Revolution explicitly makes that comparison, that you have a dual power emerging between the leaders of the army and
right.
and the rank and file of the army,
Yeah.
and this leads to the Putney debates. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So the king has been captured, and they think the war is over, and it's kind of amazing that they even bothered having them. But the army had been agitating, had been coming out with these pamphlets. They'd written a kind of a constitution and written all their demands. And so Cromwell agreed that he would send representatives, one of which was Ireton, to listen to their demands. And the meetings went on for about 12 days, something like that, and were minuted. But the minutes were then lost, and they were only found in 1890. So it kind of no one even knew this happened. This whole thing had happened until then. But well, I guess they knew it happened, but they didn't really know the details of it. But they were quite closely minuted, so you can read these debates now. And it was one of the things that's really interesting about that is that most of the political debate we hear now, people have rehearsed everything they say. They know that what position they're coming from. They know what they're going to say. But in the Putney debates, you really get the sense people were kind of feeling around. They were genuinely saying, well, what if we do this? And what if we ask for that? And where will that lead? And why shouldn't we demand this? And they were kind of feeling their way through this. These were people that had, they kind of talked amongst themselves within the Levellers, but then, and obviously the parliamentary establishment, which was mainly the gentry, they'd done the same thing, but actually confronting each other's ideas. It's really interesting to read people actually getting this some kind of reality check for the first time, that
Working out in real time.
Everyone agrees to them. Yeah, it's kind of a really interesting situation. So that's one of the reasons why I want to kind of write something about this whole thing, is the fact is it's very human and it's very real when you read the Putney debates, and it's much less performative than most of the political discussions we see now and much less rehearsed. But what happens? But the problem is then after about 12 days into this process, the king escapes, and then everything goes back. Well, we're back on a war footing now, because the king has escaped and he's gone off and rallied his armies somewhere, and now it's like we haven't got time for this anymore. You've just got to get back to the fighting. And then Cromwell, the next time there's a respite in the fighting, or the next point where they know that they're winning, they've basically got the war won, Cromwell doesn't sort of arrange a debate, a resumption of these debates. He just goes and executes the leaders of the Levellers in Burford churchyard. So he kind of saw that the writing, not that the writing was on the wall. He just didn't want to engage with this conversation about what might come next, because as far as he was concerned, what would come next was him being the new king, really. So and which he then was, or effectively, obviously he didn't have a coronation or anything, but he was dictator and until his death. And then not long after that, we get the Restoration. I kind of wonder. So I think I'm assuming that many of the people watching this are not overly familiar with 17th century English history. So I think there's a few things, and we keep referring to things, and I don't want to be, I don't want to patronize anyone, but I don't want to make the assumption that people know what we're talking about all the time as well. So there's another development called, which in English history is called the Glorious Revolution. Is that something that needs me to, should I,
We should probably explain what the Glorious Revolution is.
A quick. So Charles II was restored. The monarchy was restored with Charles II. He had no legitimate children, so his younger brother James II was going to be was his successor, and kind of people were okay with this. And then there was a problem, which was that James's first wife died, and he then married an Italian princess who was a Catholic and converted to Catholicism, and this was really upsetting for all the Protestants that had kind of spent the last 20 years, engineering their, the situation to something they liked. So they feared that then James, and then even more than that, then James and his new wife had a son who was a Catholic and would then become the next king. So they were kind of back, as far as they were concerned, this was putting us back kind of 150 years or whatever. So they just, this was too much for them to stand, really.
And I think it's important to kind of a footnote in here that Catholicism in Britain became very much a kind of was antithetical to the emerging English/British nationalism, in that it was against this idea of the freeborn Englishman. Catholics were often presented as part of this like a tyrannical hierarchy. Catholic monarchs were seen as tyrants and autocrats, and English
it was seen as very closely tied into the idea of absolute monarchy. Mm-hmm. Whereas we'd got this kind of very tentative, very fragile kind of agreement with Charles II that he could be king again, but he's, don't take the piss, mate. This is you can be king, but steady on there. And then the idea of then James II and then his son, and then that would tie him. That would mean that his son would have the backing maybe of the Pope, of the French kings, this kind of thing. And that they found this really threatening to the progress that they've made. So they cast around and they settled on William of Orange in the Netherlands, who he had a claim to the throne. I guess he was James's nephew and his son-in-law. So he did. It wasn't like they just went and found somebody on the streets. They got somebody else that kind of fitted the bill, and they invited him to come and be king, really. And he landed with a huge army, and James fled, and they just crowned William. And it was kind of a bloodless coup. There were some skirmishes, I think, but there was very little fighting. He was invited in to be king, and he showed.
There's a statue of him in Hull. We've got
Is there?
Right. We've got a gold statue of King Billy.
He didn't land in Hull, though, did he? When he came,
I don't think he did. I don't think he did land in Hull. But Hull was always a stronghold of parliamentary power. They shut the door in the king's face and told him to bugger off. Right. It was a key like emerging capitalist mercantile center. So it was very pro King Billy. But I think that's really important because so people aren't confused. The Glorious Revolution, the word revolution in the Glorious Revolution refers to the old usage of the term revolution, which was a restoration of the old order, which the Glorious Revolution wasn't really. It was kind of, but it was kind of a confirmation of that political compromise that had developed following the end of like Cromwell's son leaving, the Stuart monarchy returning, but there was like a kind of constitutional compromise. And then that was kind of worked out. Who's wearing the trousers was worked out in the Glorious Revolution, where it was like, well, Parliament is actually going to decide who the king is.
Yes, and William was invited to be king on condition that he accepted that Parliament was sovereign. And then from that point, from 1688 onwards, we had the Bill of Rights, which gave Parliament a lot more powers and limited the king's powers significantly. But it was also clear that from that point onwards, Parliament was just then going to gradually gain more and more power, and the monarchy were going to cede more and more power to Parliament. And within Parliament, the House of Commons gained more and more power, and the House of Lords, power of the House of Lords diminished over time until 1911, when it finally was kind of really reduced to its current role, really, which is quite limited. So there was this process through this kind of upheaval, lasted from 1642 when the Civil War started to 1688 when we ended up 3 monarchs later, or whatever it was, 3 monarchs and a dictator later. We ended up with Parliament being sovereign and the king being not quite. You would never have said to him that his role was to be subservient to Parliament, but that was really the writing for that was on the wall, and that's where
he
we were going.
was conceptualized as being part of Parliament, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's the
yeah,
British constitutional order is kind of the opposite of the American constitutional order, where you have what we call in Britain the fusion of powers, where everything is historically located within Parliament. So the king formed part of the body of Parliament, I guess, which was a kind of face-saving measure
yes.
for the monarchy.
And the monarch still has to give royal assent to any, and nothing can become law in the UK until now King Charles III has signed the bill into being an act. But it's, if he said no, then there would be a constitutional crisis, and that nicety would be removed. So he's always just going to sign it.
And as you pointed out, whenever constitutional crises have happened, they've, for much of the period from 1688 onwards, those crises have been resolved in favor of the House of Commons. So you mentioned the constitutional crisis in 1911, where the Lords attempted to block several liberal reforms, and basically you had a constitutional crisis, and the Prime Minister was like, well, you know what, I'll just appoint as many Lords as it takes. And so the crisis is being resolved. So there has been a kind of evolutionary change over time. The Anglo-Saxon world often likes to pride itself on like gradual reform and things like that. But that's kind of, I mean, in Britain's case, ignores the entire chaotic 48-year period of civil war and restoration and glorious revolution. I mean, in America, it's also like you had a revolution and then you had a civil war. So it's not like it's always peaceful. So the English Civil War is kind of like a birthplace of a lot of different ideas in modern politics.
Yeah, and I think it's important to see it as Hill does, as part of the capitalist revolution, and to English people don't, as we were saying before we came on air, English people like to say that we English capitalists like to say we don't like revolutions. They're not a very English thing. And when you point out to them actually that the process by which they got all the stuff that they've now got, or the system that they're now defending came about, was a revolution as well, then that puts them in a more difficult position, because they, instead of just saying I don't like revolutions, they've got to say why they like the revolution that gave them a lot of power, but they don't like one that would mean they might have to share that power out. And by power, we then obviously mean not just political power, but economic power as well. I think as well, because we've talked a lot about the kind of political machinations of the 17th century, but I think it's important as to go back and restate what we were saying earlier, which is that this is like a political flashpoint in the historical materialist conception of the transition from feudalism into capitalism. The important processes are the long processes of technological development and economic change, and then changes in economic relations, which lead to changes in social and political arrangements. The changes in social and political arrangements are the ones that involve the fighting, so they get the most attention. That doesn't mean they're the most important changes. And I think one thing I kind of alluded to earlier is if you look at enclosure, it's a really important part of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So before capitalism, private property is kind of a different thing. It's not like it is now. It's not like it is under capitalism. These people who owned huge tracts of land also had numbers of tenants who they were responsible for, who they couldn't just say, go away, I'm not feeding you, I don't have any work. That they had to kind of, they had a responsibility to them. And those people also had customary rights. They had rights to graze animals on the common, or to collect firewood from the woods, or to dig peat, or to fish in the rivers, or whatever it was. And between this kind of tiny allotment or plot of land that goes with their house and the right to use these common lands, they could kind of eke out a living. And this was this was a kind of a society where change happened very slowly. People had rents they had tenancies that were given in numbers of lifetimes, because they would be passed down through the family. And rents were kind of token amounts. They reflected a social status. You paying your rent to your landlord was just an illustration to everyone that you were their social inferior. They didn't reflect any kind of return in investment on owning the land or anything like that. And as people started to realize, actually, I could evict these people and put sheep here. The wool trade is taken off. I can build a fence around my land. I can evict these people. And that does two things. One, it gives me a sheep pasture where I can grow loads of sheep. And two, it means there's a load of people that have no means of survival who are going to need some work. And look, there's a textile factory up the road, and that, you know, we can come to some arrangement there, or I can build a textile factory up the road. I'm kind of massively simplifying, obviously.
Yeah,
but, you know.
I mean, because I think people sometimes misinterpret the meaning of aristocratic titles in Britain, because, you know, even in a place like France, there was a difference between the nobility of the sword and the nobility of the pen, like the kind of traditional medieval families who were knights at one point, and the kind of newer people who got titles from the king in more recent times. In Britain, you know, we have aristocratic titles, but if you look at the aristocracy, a big proportion of the aristocracy like comes into being in the 19th century as capitalists, either by marrying into like impoverished aristocratic families. There's a kind of fusion between the kind of aristocratic elite and the rising English capitalist class. And that even has a prehistory, with many aristocrats shifting from like this traditional feudalistic relationship with the peasantry to a kind of becoming titled capitalists with aristocratic titles. Like aristocracy as a system isn't just like, oh, you have titles. All societies have titles, right?
Yes.
America has titles: general, professor, blah blah blah. So, you know, every society has titles, but, you know, when we talk about aristocracy, we're talking about this like shift from this like traditional mode of society where you have these mutual obligations to kind of those and Marx talks about this in Communist Manifesto. These are all like obliterated for just pure exploitation.
Yes, yeah. And I think, you know, I've written in How Capitalism Ends, I'll talk about left and right, and kind of characterize the right as being split between this kind of, you get these people on the right that almost wish feudalism could be reinstated. So Jacob Rees-Mogg would, you know, like nothing more, would he? But then you also get this more kind of like mercantile kind of banking and financial elites who are much more kind of forward looking and much more kind of ruthless about everything. But actually, these two characteristics, for most people on the right, they both exist in them somewhere. It's not a bunch of kind of depressed aristocrats and separately a bunch of international financiers. These are kind of, they're very much merged into in terms of communities, but they're actually merged into each person as well. They're not they're distinct interests, but those interests are held by pretty much everyone on the right in different proportions, maybe.
And capitalism can repurpose aristocratic hierarchy as a methodology to maintain social order in a society that is constantly being disrupted by capitalist innovation.
Well, capitalists, they're very keen on meritocracy, aren't they? You know, but not so keen that they actually want their kids to be anywhere near a level playing field at any point. You know, they have to lean on this aristocracy because really they don't want meritocracy. They don't want everything to be the way they say they want it. And the people that are kind of more of the kind of nostalgic aristocratic bent are, you know,
they're more honest.
They might feel like that sentimentally, but they still want the money. You know, and owning a stately home isn't really going to bring them much money in. So they all need to compromise and work together. And the problem we have is that they do that very well, whereas the duality that I then talk about on the left, we're just really terrible at working with each other. And that's one of the advantages that the right have over us, is that they put their differences aside for the sake of defeating the left.
They're the Anglicans and we're the nonconformists, you know. And I think that's so. You know, we're getting up to the last 10 minutes, and I don't want to take too much of your time. what do you think? What would you say, like the lessons, perhaps, of the English Revolution are, and you know, why is it significant historically? I mean, like I would say for first, just as a first thing, it's like without an English Revolution, there's no American Revolution. Like the ideology of the American Revolution is predicated very much on that concept of freeborn Englishmen, of a
Yeah,
counterposing,
and very
of
possibly French Revolution as well.
yeah. So
You know,
yes,
I mean, I think they were all coming one way or another. Capitalism was going to happen, and it happened first of all in England, um, and what then it happened in France and America, and it was exported throughout Europe, and obviously now it's global, or it has global influence. But I think one of the lessons is really that actually things can change quite quickly if material as material conditions develop. You can go from looking like quite a hopeless position in I think 1629 James suspended Parliament.
mm-hmm.
No, sorry, it would have been Charles. Charles first
Charles.
suspended Parliament for 11 years. So the gentry and the emerging, but the gentry were kind of the House of Commons. They were represented in the House of Commons. That was kind of the political wing of the emerging bourgeois interest. Had no representation in the country at all. They couldn't really do anything until Charles ran out of money and had to get Parliament together again to try and raise taxes. So things that they went from being in a position where they just seemed to have hit a brick wall and weren't going anywhere, to a position where actually they were pushed enough that they then started to fight back, and they had enough they had, over the period that they'd amassed enough economic power that in that fight they turned out, they were the winners. They came out of that victorious, although there was a lot of bloodshed and it took a couple of decades. But I guess as well, another thing that we can learn is that I suppose you could say one thing is that the power of the state is really important, but I'm not. I think that's something that was true then, but I don't think that's necessarily definitively true. It's certainly true that before 1640, the state was resisting things like enclosure, and after 1688, it was kind of it continued. It kind of quadrupled in speed and was totally sanctioned by the state and done through.
Well, I think that's a really important point. I mean, you said perhaps capitalism was inevitable, but the English Revolution is not insignificant in that sense. It perhaps capitalism or the shift. I mean, we have in human history had shifts towards more mercantile societies before in China and other parts of Europe, and they have been stomped out by political development. So the English Revolution is not merely a kind of manifestation of this transformation, but it is. I would go further and say it's something that facilitated, like you said, like a qualitative leap in what capitalism could do, where the fetters on that. Capitalism's existed always, but when the king didn't want to pay the Jews back his money, throw them down York Castle, kill them all, right? But I think it's important because it's a manifestation, but also something that drives it forward. Which had it not happened,
I think the difference is, so you're always going to get groups of people who want to change things. Mm-hmm. And the significant thing is what makes that group of people successful, not just in seizing political power, but in establishing themselves as the dominant class in the new economic structure, and being able to then survive and become quite a resilient economic structure that survives into the future. And if I mean, there have been things in England before as well, and all over Europe, where people had kind of tried to resist absolute monarchy. But the difference with the English Civil War was that the people trying to do it had got this economic power that they built up, that the feudal aristocracy, and the feudal hierarchy were powerless to resist, because their power had been waning since about 1500, and the power of these kind of emerging bourgeoisie had been increasing, but that was kind of economic power and resources. And the difference, the reason what, if things had gone differently on some of the battlefields in the 1640s, and the feudal aristocracy had won the Civil War, that wouldn't have just been, oh well, we're not having capitalism then. Those people had so much power that eventually they would have come back, and maybe there'd have been another war, or maybe they would have just been able to kind of exert their influence in other ways, but we would still have moved on. The future always wins in the end, doesn't it? It's there was this kind of, nothing is inevitable in history, but you get a thing that once capitalism had got started, once people could see how much power and wealth they could gain from that, they weren't just going to go, oh well, we that was unsuccessful, let's not bother doing that anymore. There were always going to be people trying to do that, and eventually those people were going to have enough power to succeed. So I think that's another lesson, is that actually it's much more about what's going on economically than it is about we need to recognize what economic power is, and how to kind of control that, and where the levers are. Because that's, although political power is important, if you don't have the economic power behind you, the political power isn't going to last. That you can seize power. People, there are coups every now and then in the world, but if you don't have the economic power behind you, you're not going to last. So I think that the lesson from that is that we need to look at what's going on in the world materially, and what's going on in terms of people's economic circumstances and economic relationships with each other, and how we can use those, how we can leverage that to kind of move forward, in combination with taking political, having some political power too. But just having political power on its own is never going to be enough.
Okay. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Anything you want to plug before we leave?
I need to say, my new book, How Capitalism Ends, is now out. As I speak, you can probably get it in time for Christmas, but by the time this goes out, that might well be a thing of the past.
Maybe you can get it
there in the new year. So
yeah, for a New Year present, perhaps.
Yeah,
but I'll put a link to it in the description.
Cool.
And hope to have you on again at some time in the near future, Steve. And as we say on this,
always a pleasure.
We are out.